Hi, everybody. I hope you're tucked in somewhere cozy, the lights dimmed, maybe a little rain pattering softly against the window, or perhaps the gentle creak of a wooden floor below your bed. Wherever you are, tonight we're going to wander, slowly back in time. Not to the battlegrounds of knights or the grand halls of kings, but to something more quietly curious, and quite a bit more intimate. We're going to talk about love. Not just any love, no. Tonight's story is stitched from the soft, strange, sometimes scratchy fabric of medieval romance advice. You see, while the Middle Ages are often painted in stark shades of war and hardship, hidden beneath those layers is an entire tapestry of courtship customs so peculiar, they feel like they were scribbled down during a very long, very odd dream. Imagine a world without texting or dating apps where love letters were written with goose feather pens, sealed with wax, and often smelled faintly of dried herbs and maybe pig fat. A world where you might win someone's heart not with a dinner date or clever emojis, but by offering them a perfectly preserved pear, or, more daringly, a single embroidered glove that had been blessed by a monk. Our story tonight is not a history lesson. It is a slow walk along old cobbled streets lined with flickering lanterns and the scent of fresh bread. It is the echo of a lute in a stone hall. It's a half-whispered poem scratched into the corner of a church pew. It's what happened when love tried to bloom in a world of superstition, chivalry, body odor, and very questionable dental hygiene. And as we meander through each chapter of this tale, I invite you to let your thoughts drift like candle smoke. There's no need to remember every name or date. Just let the scenes unfold. Now, before we dive into glove gifts and astrology charts, we must first understand a bit about the setting, because love, after all, doesn't grow in a vacuum. It grows in gardens, kitchens, taverns, monasteries, and sometimes in the middle of political negotiations. So let's take a moment to arrive fully in the medieval world. Close your eyes and imagine. It's the year 1273. The sun has just set over a small town in what is now southern France. The market stalls are being packed away, their wooden slats creaking as merchants yawn and count their coins. Somewhere, a cow is mooing its final opinion of the day. In a stone cottage not far from the town square, a young woman, her hair tightly braided and her cheeks flushed from the cool air, is writing a letter by candlelight. The ink is made from oak galls and wine. The paper, rare and precious, made from linen rags. She pauses between lines, biting her lip. She wants to tell the boy from the bakery that his voice reminds her of warm bread, but she's not sure how to phrase it without sounding improper. Across town, that very boy is nervously carving a heart into a piece of pear wood. He's been told by his aunt, who claims she once met a monk who read about it in a scroll, that if a girl eats fruit carved by someone who loves her, she'll dream of them that night. Is it true? No one knows. But when you're 17 and your knowledge of the opposite sex comes mostly from overheard songs in the tavern, you're willing to believe in carved pears and singing vegetables. This is the world of medieval love advice, a patchwork of folklore, religion, herbal remedies, and deep, deep awkwardness. There were guides written in Latin by celibate monks. There were rhyming ditties passed around by minstrels. There were noble women who swore on secret rituals and kitchen maids who swore by garlic. And behind it all, there was this unshakable belief that love was not just a feeling, it was a force, a kind of invisible current that could be studied, manipulated, redirected. Love had rules. It had recipes. It even had courtroom cases. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Tonight, and over the many parts to come, we're going to explore these strange and tender rules. Each chapter will uncover another layer: the food, the clothing, the superstitions, the letters, the music, the gifts, and even the garden rendezvous. Some of what you'll hear may seem ridiculous, some oddly touching, and a few things might make you wonder if we've really changed that much at all. Because even now, don't we still whisper our crushes into the folds of scarves? Don't we still believe in lucky charms, first glances, shared laughter across a crowded room? The wrapping may be different, but the core is the same. A heart beating a little faster. A hope rising like yeast in warm dough. A voice maybe a little shaky asking, "Do you like me?" So here we are, at the edge of the journey. The room is quiet now. The candle flickers. The parchment is laid out, fresh and empty. And the heart, medieval or modern, waits for the next chapter. Shall we begin? In the dim quiet of a candlelit room, where shadows danced like lazy ghosts on the walls, a young man named Tomlin sat hunched over a scrap of parchment. His tongue pressed against the corner of his mouth, eyes narrowed in fierce concentration. This, he believed with his whole heart, was not just ink he was putting to paper. It was magic, the kind of magic that could make a milkmaid blush or cause a noble woman to sigh from the depths of her perfumed sleeve. You see, in the Middle Ages, writing a love letter was a high-stakes performance, a bit like juggling flaming torches while standing on a one-legged goose. There were expectations. Not only did the words need to sound poetic, romantic, or vaguely biblical, but the letter itself had to smell right. Yes, smell. Letters in medieval times weren't just meant to be read, they were meant to be experienced. If you handed someone a plain piece of unscented parchment with no frills or fragrance, well, that was just one small step up from passing them a grocery list. So Tomlin, like many before him, had turned to his mother's old herbal manual, the kind passed down through generations of women who knew their way around both cooking pots and love plots. He'd soaked the paper in rosewater first, then dabbed the corners with a cloth steeped in cloves and lavender, and finally, for reasons he didn't fully understand, tucked a single fennel seed between the folds. His neighbor swore it made girls dream of the letter writer, and this was tame by medieval standards. In truth, many believed that a truly successful love letter required not only the right scent, but also a touch of the supernatural. There were guides, some found in dusty monastic libraries, others whispered behind bread stalls, detailing how to make what were sometimes called romance elixirs. These were love potions, though the word potion may be a bit generous. Some were little more than herb-laced teas. Others, however, were more adventurous. Take, for example, the Lombardy Love Wash, a recipe found in a 14th century Italian compendium of romantic solutions. To create this miracle liquid, you were to boil together basil, mint, and powdered nutmeg in red wine. Then, and this is important, you must soak a strip of cloth in the mixture, sleep with it under your pillow, and the next morning, wring a single drop into the shoe of the one you desired. Yes, into their shoe, preferably without their knowledge. It was believed that the warmth of their foot would activate the ingredients and their feelings. One must assume the success rate was questionable, but it certainly led to some very nice-smelling footwear. But not all potions were so subtle. Some called for ashes of burnt dandelions, mixed with honey and consumed at midnight under a waxing moon. Others required stranger ingredients, hair clippings, nail fragments, or in one alarming case from Saxony, a drop of blood drawn from the tip of one's finger and stirred into mulled cider. That last one, by the way, was banned by at least 3 abbeys and a particularly upset bishop, but let's not judge too harshly. In a world without psychology or dating coaches, where marriages were often arranged and love had to sneak in through the back door, people turned to what they knew: plants, prayers, and a pinch of superstition, and sometimes, just sometimes, these methods were less about casting a spell on someone else and more about giving the courage to the caster. Because perhaps it wasn't the lavender or the fennel seed that made the heart flutter, but the care taken to tuck it into the letter. The belief, however misguided, that one was doing everything possible to make love bloom. Still, the church had opinions. Some clergy were known to preach against such practices. There were fiery sermons warning young people against pagan herbs and the witchery of perfume. One rather dramatic friar in Wales claimed that the smell of musk was the devil's breath in disguise. He was later found to own several bottles of it, but despite the occasional ecclesiastical disapproval, the practice continued. In fact, it became common enough that some apothecaries began advertising what they politely called elixirs of affection. These were small vials of scented oil, often labeled with vague promises like to soften the heart, or to inspire the gaze of sweet regard. The more expensive ones came with miniature love poems folded inside. One shop in Bruges even offered scented ink, made from crushed violets and cinnamon, specifically marketed to aspiring poets and bashful bachelors. Of course, all this sniffing and steeping wasn't limited to letters. Love potions were also consumed with varying results. There's a delightful story from a small town in Bavaria about a man who drank a love potion made from wine, thyme, and powdered staghorn. Instead of falling in love, he spent 3 days speaking only in rhymes and proposing to his neighbor's goat. The goat reportedly declined. So, were these scented letters and strange concoctions truly effective? Perhaps not in the ways their creators intended, but they tell us something quietly beautiful about the people who made them. They speak of longing and hope, of the very human desire to be seen, to be wanted, to feel that one's heart might matter to someone else's. And in that way, maybe a letter that smells of cloves and rose petals isn't so different from a text message sent at midnight, or a carefully chosen song shared across earbuds. They are all small spells, soft, silly, heartfelt spells, whispered into the universe in the hope that someone, somewhere will feel them and whisper back. The wind outside rattles the wooden shutters. Somewhere far off, a dog gives a sleepy bark. And here, in the hush of evening, we return once more to a time of whispers and wool cloaks, of candlelight and curious customs. Tonight's tale is woven around something small, something soft, something easily overlooked in the age of swords and banners. But in the right hands, oh, it could speak volumes. The glove. Yes, the humble glove. In today's world, we wear them to keep warm, to drive, to garden. But in the Middle Ages, a glove was more than an accessory. It was a message, a signal, a gesture of courtship, so charged with meaning that it could change a relationship's course entirely. Let's begin in the year 1324, in a town nestled along the River Rhine. A young nobleman, let's call him Albrecht, is pacing nervously outside the home of Lady Margareta. He's not holding flowers, not a box of sweets. No. In his gloved hand, he holds another glove. It's dainty, soft kid leather, stitched carefully with golden thread. Inside, he's hidden a single rosemary leaf, known to symbolize remembrance. Why? Because if Margareta accepts this glove, if she takes it from him and presses it to her cheek or tucks it into her sleeve, it is as good as saying, "Yes, I feel the same." A medieval, "I like you too." But if she returns it, or worse, if she drops it to the ground without a word, well, that glove might as well be a broken heart. The glove, you see, was a language all its own. In an era when direct romantic speech was often frowned upon, especially for women, subtlety became essential. And what could be subtler, more laden with coded meaning than the passing of a perfectly perfumed glove? It wasn't just about giving a glove. It was how you gave it, when you gave it, what kind of glove it was. A velvet glove meant affection. A silk one hinted at admiration, but perhaps from afar. A glove worn during a tournament and then handed to a lady carried the sweat and triumph of its wearer, a potent token of devotion. Some knights were known to ride into battle with their beloved's glove tied to their lance or tucked inside their armor, close to the heart. Others embroidered secret initials along the inner cuff. A secret, only visible when the glove was removed in private. It became something of an art, the crafting of the perfect romantic glove. Certain workshops in Italy and Flanders grew famous not just for their leatherwork, but for understanding the delicate dance of glove-giving. They offered options scented with ambergris, lined with ermine, or dyed in soft hues that supposedly aligned with the giver's intent. There were even small glove poems, written on scrolls no longer than a pinky finger rolled tightly and tucked into the finger of the glove before gifting, a favorite among troubadours and bashful scholars. But not everyone used gloves for pure intentions. There are records, quite amusing ones really, of mischievous noblemen sending gloves doused not in perfume, but in rather unpleasant substances. One lady in Toulouse received a pair of scented gloves from a suitor she had rejected the month prior. The smell was so foul, her maid fainted on the spot. Of course, the lady simply sent the gloves back, along with a bag of onions and a note. These at least are honest, but most glove-giving stayed within the bounds of charm and mystery. There's something deeply romantic about the quiet power of it. The idea that such a small thing could carry such weight. Even in literature of the time, gloves appear again and again as symbols of love or favor. In Arthurian tales, a knight receives a lady's glove before embarking on a dangerous quest. In one medieval romance poem, a farmer woos a widow with a glove stitched finer than a bishop's words. And perhaps the most curious of all is the tale of the glove duel. Yes, there were occasions when a glove did not signal love, but rather conflict. To throw a glove at someone's feet was to issue a challenge, a duel of honor. So you can imagine the scandal when, at a midsummer festival in 1391, a young woman named Elspeth gently tossed a glove in front of not one, but two suitors, both of whom interpreted it as a challenge. They fought. She watched, then married neither, choosing instead a merchant who sold spices and did not stab people before breakfast. Now perhaps you're wondering, why gloves of all things? Why not handkerchiefs or rings? Well, gloves were practical. They were personal. They were often handmade or custom fit. And perhaps most importantly, they were intimately tied to the sense of touch, something rare and precious in a society where physical contact between lovers was often forbidden or restricted. To hold someone's glove was to imagine holding their hand. To receive a glove was to be invited into someone's private world, even just a little. And that's where our story tonight pauses. With a glove on a wooden table, beside a bowl of rosemary and lemon peel, a candle flickers nearby, casting gentle shadows. Outside, the night wind hums a quiet tune. We've only just begun to uncover the odd, sweet, and fragrant rituals of medieval romance. But tomorrow, we'll lean in closer still, to the words whispered around tavern fires and cathedral stones. Because next, we enter the realm of gossip, and how in the Middle Ages, it might have been your best wingman. In a world where letters were slow and privacy nearly impossible, a certain kind of magic thrived in the cracks between walls, in the low hum of a marketplace, in the quiet corners of stone kitchens. That magic? Gossip. Now, before we wrinkle our brows or raise an eyebrow in judgment, let's settle into the candlelight and consider this. In medieval times, gossip was not always cruel or idle. In fact, it was often seen as useful, even essential, particularly when it came to the murky waters of courtship. Let's imagine you're a young woman in a village outside York, somewhere around the year 1308. Your days are full of spinning, wool, collecting eggs, and avoiding your younger brother's muddy antics. You don't leave the house much except for church on Sundays and the occasional trip to the well. You have your eye on a young carpenter. His name is Elias. He once helped your uncle fix a broken bench, and when he smiled, you thought of sunlight on warm bread. But you've never spoken to him. In fact, you're not even sure he knows your name. So what do? You turn to the most powerful force in your village, your Aunt Agnes, who happens to chat regularly with the mother of Elias's apprentice. Within 2 days, Elias has heard, casually in passing, that someone in town finds his hammering impressively rhythmic. Einchown. The end of the week, Elias is offering you the best cuts of kindling at market. Coincidence? Perhaps, but more likely, you've just engaged in medieval matchmaking by murmurs. You see, gossip in this time was not just entertainment, it was information currency, passed along with purpose. People whispered not only for scandal, but for strategy. Think of it like the social network of the 14th century, except instead of posts, you had bread ovens, fountains, and chapel pews. And instead of likes, you had raised eyebrows and knowing glances. In small communities where social circles were tightly knit and daily rhythms predictable, a single well-placed comment could shift romantic fate. If someone was considered pleasant, of spirit, or sound of tooth, you might hear it whispered near the butter churn. If someone was thought to have questionable hygiene or an overly loud sneeze, well, that too would circulate. But more often than not, Gossip worked as a gentle nudge, a well-meaning meddling. It was common for friends or family members to accidentally mention someone's name in flattering terms while in public, hoping the word would reach the right ears. Oh, he brings home extra firewood for his mother? What a thoughtful lad. Or, she sings while baking. Like a bird, that one. These weren't idle observations. They were little gifts, tucked into the air, carried along by whispers and hopeful timing. There's even evidence that some towns had literal whispering walls, spots known for being acoustic sweet spots, where you could murmur a message on one side and have it heard clearly on the other. One such wall exists to this day in a cathedral cloister in northern Spain. Locals call it El Muro del Susurro, the murmuring wall. It's said that young lovers, or those too shy to speak aloud, would go there and have their friends deliver messages in hushed tones, echoed across the smooth stone like a sacred secret. Historians are cautious with such tales. But even if these walls were more legend than fact, their idea holds truth, that love often traveled faster on the breath of a whisper than on the ink of a letter. And there's something beautifully communal about that, a kind of shared investment in romance, where a neighbor, a friend, even a milkmaid might become part of the courtship process, not by direct meddling, but by softly spreading favorable impressions. It wasn't all soft focus and sweetness, of course. Sometimes gossip was weaponized. Rival suitors might attempt to tarnish each other's reputations. He has fleas, one might murmur, and once cried over a cheese. Whether true or not, these whispers had the power to sway public opinion. There are even records of legal complaints being filed over slanderous romantic gossip. In one delightful case from 1389, a woman accused her rival of spreading falsehoods about a stolen bonnet and a priest's smile. The wording is vague, but one imagines it caused quite a stir. Still, the majority of romantic gossip was playful, hopeful, and often hilariously awkward. One scribe in London noted that in the springtime, gossip about love increased threefold, particularly among bakers, brewers, and barbers. He blamed it on the warming of blood and the freedom of ale, which frankly sounds about right. But perhaps the most telling example of gossip's role in love comes not from a document, but from a ballad. In a 15th century song called The Baker's Smile, a woman sings of how she first heard her future husband's name from the lips of her cousin, who heard it from the apothecary's boy, who had overheard it from a shepherd who had listened to it being muttered by an old nun after a sneeze. Ridiculous? Absolutely. But also kind of perfect. Because love, especially the shy kind, rarely arrives directly. It tiptoes. It echoes. It builds itself slowly, through glances and hints and the gentle nudging of 100 quiet voices. And in that sense, gossip wasn't just talk. It was a bridge. A beautifully crooked, human, whispering bridge between hearts. The streets of Paris in the 13th century were a mix of smells and stone, of echoing footsteps and gossip in Latin and Old French. It was a time when the Seine glimmered beneath candlelit windows, when bakers rose before the sun, and when beauty, the kind that made hearts flutter and letters bloom, was measured by a very particular yardstick. Tonight we slow our pace and linger among these cobbled streets, peeking into smoky taverns, quiet chapels, and market stalls where laughter and flirtation drift like morning bread steam. Because if we're to understand how love blossomed in this medieval city, we must first understand what was considered beautiful. And let me tell you, it's not quite what you'd expect. Let's begin with the forehead. In modern times, a high forehead might be considered a sign of intellect or elegance. In 13th century Paris, it was nothing short of divine. A truly fashionable woman would pluck her hairline to achieve a dome-like forehead, as smooth and vast as a cathedral arch. Some even applied a paste of vinegar and walnut oil to encourage the hair to recede, creating what poets called the moon's ascent upon the face. It wasn't painful, they said, just mildly stinging. And if your neighbors winced at the sight, well, they clearly didn't understand refinement. But why such fascination with foreheads? Some scholars point to religious symbolism, the forehead being the seat of the soul's visibility. Others suggest that in an era of veils and modesty, it was simply one of the few places a woman could dress up without breaking decorum. Whatever. The reason, high foreheads were in. So much so that a woman with bangs might be gently pitied or worse, assumed to be hiding a low brow, both literally and metaphorically. Next, we arrive at the eyebrows, or rather, the lack thereof. Much like the forehead, eyebrows were often plucked into near extinction, leaving behind faint curved ghosts above the eyes. This gave the face an ethereal, almost surprised expression which was considered mysterious and alluring. Heavy brows? Too masculine. Straight brows? Too serious. No brows? A face like a poem. For men, however, a touch of brow was acceptable, especially if paired with soulful eyes and a gently furrowed brow, as though one were always pondering the tragic fate of romantic nights. And what of skin? Pale skin was prized, deeply, fervently, sometimes alarmingly so. To appear sun-kissed was to be associated with labor, outdoor work, and the unromantic realities of farm life. The ideal woman was indoorsy, with cheeks like fresh milk and hands that had never met a hoe. Women would dust their skin with white lead powder, mixed with ground pearls if they could afford it. The result was a ghostly glow, sometimes veering into chalky territory. There are accounts of noble women fainting in church simply from the weight of their beauty regimen. One chronicler in Paris noted that Lady Blanche de Nevers collapsed thrice in Lent, her skin made delicate by God and ointments. One suspects the lead had more to do with it than God. Hair? Oh, now we come to something truly enchanting. Golden hair was ideal. Not just any gold, but pale, almost straw-like gold, reminiscent of saints and sunlight on wheat fields. To achieve this, some women used a mixture of chamomile, saffron, and stale beer, which was rubbed into the scalp and left to bake in the sun. Yes, beer. It was believed that beer's yeasty properties lightened the hair and gave it volume. As a result, spring afternoons in Paris were occasionally interrupted by noble women sitting on rooftops, hair splayed out like halos, smelling faintly of a tavern. Brunettes? Still beautiful, of course, but in the mysterious, less heavenly way. Some even wore veils to conceal their darker locks, lest they be mistaken for Italian, which, depending on the year, was either a flirtatious compliment or a political insult. And now we turn to the mouth, that soft messenger of sonnets and secret smiles. Small rosebud lips were favored, but rouge was frowned upon in polite society, unless one was married, in which case a touch of crushed berries might be permitted before a festival. What really mattered was dental neatness. Clean, even teeth were associated with good health and divine favor. And since toothbrushes were rare, some used twigs of mint or rosemary to clean their teeth, creating breath that not only impressed, but also invoked affection, according to a Parisian physician. For men, the standards were both simpler and stricter. A tall frame was admired, particularly if one's shoulders were broad and posture knightly. Hair should be kept just above the shoulder, preferably waved, though not curled unless one were a troubadour or dangerously fashionable. Beards were optional, but stubble? No thank you. A clean-shaven face or a full manicured beard showed purpose. In-between fuzz suggested laziness or indecision, traits unsuitable for a husband and laughable in a lover. Clothing, too, played its role. A man's belt was not just functional, it was an indicator of his romantic availability. A belt tied loosely to one side suggested flirtation. A tightly cinched waist with a short tunic? Best avoided unless you liked men who recited love poems to their reflection. And yet, for all these curious standards, for all the plucking, powdering, and perfuming, love, as always, found its own way. There are letters and ballads that speak of lovers with crooked noses and freckles, of smiles that defied symmetry and laughter that ignored fashion. One French poem tells of a man who fell for a woman with a laugh like spilled wine. Unexpected, ungraceful, but intoxicating all the same. Because even in a world obsessed with high foreheads and pale skin, True affection often bloomed in the gaps between ideals. In the twinkle of an eye, the tilt of a smile, the way someone held a loaf of bread as if it were a newborn dove. So as we leave 13th century Paris behind, let us do so gently, with respect for those who tried, so earnestly, to shape beauty into rules, and with gratitude that love messy and magical often refuse to follow them. Some say the way to the heart is through the stomach. In the Middle Ages, this idea was taken rather seriously, though with a distinctly medieval flair, involving questionable herbs, symbolic stews, and a surprising number of egg yolks. So tonight, let's drift into the kitchens and banquet halls of the past. Not the grand feasting chambers of kings and dukes, mind you, but the quieter corners where romance simmered between boiling pots and flickering hearths. Because here, among the smells of cinnamon, sage, and roasting goose, we find a most curious kind of courtship, the culinary seduction. Let's begin in a small manor house outside Winchester, around the year 1292. A kitchen maid named Isolde prepares a dish of pottage, a thick, savory stew of leeks, barley, and rabbit. But tucked within, the pot hidden among the sage leaves is a tiny clove of garlic carved with a cross. It's not for flavor, it's for luck. She's been told, by her aunt, who heard it from a traveling tanner, that if a man eats garlic marked with a cross from a woman's hand, he'll dream of her 3 nights hence. Tonight, that man is the blacksmith's apprentice, and while he may not taste the carved clove among the meat, Isolde watches closely for any signs of swooning. Because in medieval times, food was a message, sometimes sweet, sometimes spicy, and occasionally laced with herbs believed to stir the blood. Take the humble apple. A woman might slice it into thin wedges, sprinkle it with rosemary, and offer it to her intended wrapped in linen. If he accepted and ate it with good cheer, it was taken as a sign of mutual interest. If he returned it uneaten, well, the linen was often repurposed as a handkerchief for crying. There were love soups, brewed with chickpeas, fennel, and just a whisper of mint. These were said to inspire softness of heart and lightness of tongue, perfect for evening conversations under the stars. And then, of course, there was bread. A staple of every meal, bread became a subtle stage for flirtation. One popular tradition involved baking a small object, usually a dried flower or a coin, into a loaf, then presenting it during a shared meal. Whoever found the token was fated to speak their heart before the bread was finished. More than one couple began their journey over a tooth-cracked daisy, but the real magic lay in the aphrodisiacs of the age. Today, we might chuckle at the idea of oysters or chocolate setting a romantic mood, but medieval cooks had their own list of foods thought to inspire affection, or at least a certain kind of warm curiosity. Nutmeg, for instance, was treasured not only for its flavor, but for its supposed ability to encourage the humors of joy. It was grated into wine, dusted over roasted pears, and stirred into warm milk before bed. Mustard seeds were believed to heat the blood and were often added liberally to meat dishes served during courtship dinners. Then there was borage, a cheerful blue flower that grew like a weed and was thought to give courage in matters of love. Cooks would float it atop honeyed wine or press it into jellied fruits, whispering, "For boldness of the heart." Perhaps the most eyebrow-raising inclusion in medieval romantic cuisine was the coxcomb. Yes, the red crest atop a rooster's head. When boiled and served in aspic, it was believed to excite passion, though one wonders whether passion was truly inspired by the flavor or by the sheer bravery required to eat it. And yet it wasn't just what was served, it was how it was served. In many households, a shared meal was a rare and meaningful thing. Eating together, truly, deliberately, was considered intimate. Feeding someone with your own hands even more so. There are recorded customs where a woman would place a morsel of food into a man's mouth during festivals, especially during spring celebrations like May Day. This was no small gesture. It was a whisper without words, a soft invitation. "I have prepared this, I offer it, do you receive it?" Of course, food could also tease and test. There are tales of noble women sending trays of delicacies to potential suitors. with one item ever so slightly oversalted or burned. If the suitor returned the tray untouched, he was seen as ungrateful. If he ate everything with a smile, he was praised for his gallantry. If he dared to comment on the flaw, well, that was the end of that courtship. But it wasn't only women who used food as flirtation. Men too took to the kitchen, or at least commissioned dishes, when their hearts were stirred. There's a recorded case of a young scribe in Rouen who sent a girl a bowl of rose custard, sweetened with honey and spiced with cardamom. Attached was a note that read, "If thy sweetness matches this dish, I shall not live long unmarried." She married a shoemaker 3 months later, but the scribe's custard was talked about for years. And then, of course, there were the feasts. Public. Displays of affection weren't always proper, but at feasts, lines blurred, music played, wine flowed. Platters were passed with flirtatious glances and little notes carved into apple peels. Some lovers arranged to sit beside each other at banquets, swapping bites of candied almonds or feeding each other figs in syrup. A shared goblet, passed back and forth, became a chalice of slowly blooming trust. Even table scraps told a story. In some traditions, saving a morsel of meat from one's own plate and offering it later in private was a sign of deep affection, a way of saying, even in indulgence I thought of you. So as we tuck ourselves beneath the covers tonight, perhaps we can smile at the idea that in a world of swords and sermons, a bowl of warm stew or a shared pear could carry the weight of a heart. And perhaps the next time you stir honey into tea, or break bread with someone dear, you'll remember that once upon a time it might have been a declaration of love. It begins, as many things did in medieval Europe, with a knight and a lady. She stands at a balcony, perhaps draped in silk, her eyes like winter stars. He kneels below, hand to heart, pledging to serve her, to fight for her honor, to suffer sweetly for her smile. There are poems, sighs, oaths, a rose tucked into a gauntlet, a lute strumming faintly somewhere in the background. This, we are told, is courtly love. But as we settle deeper into our pillows tonight, let's allow ourselves a small, curious question, the kind whispered behind tapestries and under the breath. Was it love, or just an elaborate game? Courtly love, fin amour, as it was known in the Languedoc of the troubadours, emerged in the courts of southern France in the 12th century. It soon swept across Europe from Italy to England, coloring literature, behavior, and romantic ideals for generations. It had rules. Oh, so many rules. Love, in this system, was not about marriage. In fact, it often flourished best outside of it. Marriage was duty, property, politics. Courtly love was the opposite. A voluntary bond, often secret between a knight and a noblewoman, unbound by legal ties and often complicated by, well, someone already being married. It was based on longing, admiration from afar, unconsummated desire. The lady was elevated, often older or of higher status. The man was the supplicant, devoted, loyal, and tormented in just the right poetic measure. If it all sounds like emotional theater, that's because in many ways, it was. Let's visit the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen, patron of the arts, and one of the great influencers of this romantic tradition. In her salons, poets and troubadours debated questions of the heart with the seriousness of theologians. They asked things like, is love possible within marriage? Is jealousy a necessary part of love? Should a lady accept a kiss before the 3rd month of secret affection? These weren't just idle musings. These were mock trials of the heart, often judged by the queen herself and her circle of ladies. Love became not only a sentiment, but a structured, performative ideal. A knight might spend months writing poetry for his lady, performing deeds of valor in her name, and then, maybe, if the stars aligned, receive a token, a ribbon, a glance, a whispered blessing before battle. But real physical affection, rare, often forbidden, sometimes just implied in metaphor and musical key. And so we ask again, was this love? Or was it a kind of romantic pageantry? Certainly, many believe deeply in it. Troubadours wrote of love so pure they were practically divine. A knight in one poem says he would rather die than kiss the hand of his lady, for the desire is sweeter than any fulfillment. But others, quietly, raised eyebrows. 13th century. Cleric described courtly love as a sweet sickness, best suffered in poetry, worst in practice. He may have had a point. There's a particularly amusing story about a knight named Gerard who followed the rules of courtly love so strictly that when his lady finally did offer him a kiss, he fainted. It took a pitcher of wine and several minutes of fanning to revive him. The lady reportedly never offered a second. What's more, courtly love was rarely egalitarian. While it positioned the lady as powerful, almost like a goddess to be worshipped, it was still often scripted by male poets, shaped by male desire, and performed within male-dominated court spaces. The lady might be adored, but she was also idealized, restricted, and frequently fictionalized. Real women had household duties, childbirth, and political alliances to manage. Not all had time to sit by windows reading sonnets. Still, some women did engage the system to their advantage. A clever lady might maintain multiple admirers, knights eager to impress, fight, or compose for her favor, while keeping her true thoughts to herself. There are letters and records of women playing the game just as deftly, using wit and wisdom to direct the flow of attention without ever yielding more than a smile. In this way, courtly love became a kind of social fencing, a way to express feelings and power within tightly bound rules. And let's not forget, it was also entertaining. Imagine a dull winter evening in a drafty castle. The fire burns low. The air smells faintly of wax and wet wool. What better way to pass the hours than with a contest of verses, a flirtatious exchange of riddles, a declaration of love so grand it made your cousin blush? Courtly love was not always sincere, but it was always vivid. So what became of it? Over time, as ideas of marriage shifted and romantic expectations changed, the strict codes of courtly love faded, but its ghost remains. Every time someone sighs over unspoken feelings, every time a romantic comedy teases out tension for 90 minutes before the kiss, we echo those old rhythms. We may no longer tie scarves to lances or recite poetry from horseback, but we still know what it is to long, to admire from afar, to rehearse the perfect line in our heads, and sometimes we too choose performance over passion, at least for a while. So was courtly love truly love? Perhaps not in the way we define it today, but it was a mirror, showing us what people wished love could be. Noble, dramatic, poetic, and just a little bit tragic. And as we drift into sleep tonight, perhaps we can smile at the thought of some long-ago knight scribbling rhymes in the torchlight, practicing his bow and dreaming of a lady who may or may not have remembered his name. The night sky of old Europe was not just a canopy of twinkling lights. It was a living tapestry, woven with meaning, longing, and cosmic instruction. For those seeking love in medieval times, it offered much more than beauty. It offered predictions, promises, and possibly even permission to let the heart stir. Tonight, let's lift our gaze, figuratively for now, and explore how astrology shaped medieval romance. We'll discover how lovers consulted the heavens before confessing their feelings, how planetary alignments dictated ideal wooing times, and how stars might have whispered secrets of the heart. Imagine a chilly evening in 1315 in a small town on the outskirts of Prague. A scholar named Jiri sits at his desk by a single lantern, a wax tablet in front of him. The moon is waxing, Venus rises in the east, and Mars hides behind a veil of clouds. Jiri isn't studying theology tonight. He's researching love. He checks his astrolabe, adjusts the sighting for Jupiter's position, and murmurs, "Venus in exaltation, moon in Leo. She is softened in spirit." He writes an exact phrase on his tablet, the medieval equivalent of a Tinder status. Tonight is the right night. Astrology and love were intertwined in countless ways. Before pen was set to parchment, medieval lovers often consulted almanacs, tiny books that contained birth charts and seasonal recommendations. Some almanacs advised against confessing love under certain signs. Others suggested that an eclipse near Saturn would cloud judgment and introduce risings of doubt. One 14th century French guidebook offered intriguing advice. Should you wish to invite a maiden to speak, wait until the hour of Venus when the planet sits highest. But should Mars stand in the path of your sign, delay your visit by a fortnight. This was not idle poetry, it was practical counsel. Noblemen might hire astrologers to cast charts for themselves and for their intended. A favorable chart could mean the difference between a hopeful conversation and a social misstep. Astrological timing extended to daily routines. Quite often, couples were told to plan meetings before dawn, when the moon and Venus were still in harmonious alignment, or at the golden hour just before dusk, which some believed was an ideal time for emotional resonance. In one charming example from northern Spain, a suitor who repeatedly tried to woo a noblewoman at inappropriate times, say after sunset or during a weekday, was gently lectured by the court astrologer and asked to walk by during the 8th lunar hour on a Thursday. He complied, bearing a simple bouquet at precisely the correct time. Legend says it worked. Even birth charts played a starring role. If a lover had the same ascendant as Mars, they were said to be bold, active, and impatient. If Venus dominated their chart, the easiest configuration for romance, they were charming and affectionate by nature. This led to a curious medieval scenario. People would share horoscopes on parchments in the marketplace. One might learn that their balked crush was actually under a cold sign, unsuited for romance. Another might discover that their own natal chart signaled prosperity and love if you act on Easter Eve. Some astrologers were so confident in their matchmaking advice that they charged not only for the chart, but for a love affirmation scroll, sealed with red wax and stamped with the symbol of Venus and Mercury entwined. Let's pause for a moment and marvel. Here we are today, relying on dating apps, museums of memes, and romantic playlists. They decide when we message, when we like a photo, when we press play on a song. Medieval lovers awaited whispers from the cosmos, texts from the heavens, so to speak. There is something tender and earnest in that. Even when the advice feels whimsical or overwritten, the intention is the same. Is this the right moment? Still, astrology in love had its critics. Churchmen often frowned upon the practice, claiming that it bordered on heresy. One bishop wrote in 1372, "To defer affection on the basis of star positions is to submit the heart to false gods." He may have had a point, for love, as we know, doesn't always check the charts. Others recognized astrology's power as psychological comfort. A chart that marked you in danger of heartbreak might warn you off, perhaps sparing a bruised ego. Or a prediction of romantic success could give you confidence to speak your heart. In that way, astrology was both roadmap and gentle guardrail, a medieval cousin to our modern know-your-sign mentality. Some lovers embraced their star-type destinies. In a tale from Italy, a woman named Lucia postponed her reply for months, claiming that her answer would be given when Mars sits in the house of Cupids. When that night arrived, she sent for her suitor, and his proposal succeeded. Whether coincidence or artful romantic staging, the story spread, becoming a template for hopeful hearts everywhere. Astrology even colored promises of commitment. To affirm love, one might say, let us meet again on the third night after the blessed crescent. It lent a soft solemnity to the anticipation. So as we drift toward sleep, what are we left with? A sky considered not just for beauty but for guidance. A system where we might chart love like a cosmic journey, calculating the hours, reading the signs, timing our conversations for the best celestial alignment. We might smile now at the rituals, waiting for Venus, consulting charts, aligning hearts with constellations. But in their hearts, medieval lovers felt the same hope that we do. That moment when the unknown breaks and becomes something more. And if the charts failed? If Venus turned cold, or the moon refused to shine? Then love, brave as ever, found a way, anyway. Often, against all advice. And yet, perfectly on time. Jemne, new ban hin len bao troi, vako the mimquoi, pietrang motraitim tukash jaibe, tramnam ko the junlam jiutong, tun hong bai gio chung ta jen hong bi saun guyen. Good night from the silent heavens. It's a lazy spring afternoon in the year 1357. The breeze carries the scent of lilacs and fresh bread. In the courtyard of a modest manor near Ghent, two young people sit on opposite sides of a small bench. Between them, a large wheel of cheese, a loaf of rye bread, and two rather determined chaperones. One is the girl's aunt, who hasn't blinked in 20 minutes. The other is the boy's cousin, who keeps loudly clearing his throat every time the conversation gets too lively. And yet, despite the surveillance, despite the awkward silences and crumb-strewn laps, something is happening. A look, a laugh, a shared bite of warm spiced cheese. It's not exactly romantic by modern standards, but in medieval terms, this is a very promising date. In the Middle Ages, love may have stirred hearts, but it rarely moved unobserved. Privacy between young, unmarried people, especially those of the same social standing, was often discouraged, if not outright forbidden. Reputation was everything. Even the appearance of impropriety could lead to scandal, gossip, or worse, a premature marriage negotiation. So what did this mean for hopeful lovers? It meant that romantic encounters were rarely one-on-one. They were group affairs, choreographed dances of conversation and cheese, often conducted under the watchful eye of family or trusted companions. These gatherings had many names. In England, they were sometimes called evening company. In parts of Italy, they were known as sitting parlors. But the spirit was the same. Two people who might be interested in one another, surrounded by a buffer zone of baked goods and elderly relatives. One popular setting was the village picnic, organized by churches, guilds, or occasionally nosy neighbors. These events provided a safe, structured space for social interaction. Blankets were spread, games were played, jokes were told, loudly, so that no single voice ever dipped into secrecy. And at the center of it all, food, usually something hearty and shareable, stews, bread, roasted onions, pickled eggs, and always cheese. Why cheese? Well, for one, it was communal. It had to be sliced, divided, passed around. It encouraged interaction. You couldn't eat it without at least some cooperation. A popular choice was a warm, semi-soft cheese baked with garlic and herbs, easy to dip bread into, hard to hoard, and pleasantly distracting when the conversation lagged. But these group dates weren't just about avoiding scandal. They were informal vetting sessions. Parents, aunts, uncles, even younger siblings would quietly observe. Did the boy stand when the girl entered? Did she smile too broadly at his jokes? Did he pass the cheese before serving himself? These tiny gestures were scrutinized for signs of character. One mother in a Flemish village reportedly rejected a suitor for greedy slicing, a clear indication, she claimed, of selfishness in marriage. In one recorded account from France, a girl's older brother refused to allow her to continue speaking to a young man who double-dipped in the honey bowl. It sounds petty, but etiquette was everything. A marriage could hinge on the angle of a ladle, and yet, somehow, miraculously, real affection still bloomed. Despite the pressure, despite the hovering eyes and judgmental aunties, young people found ways to connect. A whispered comment as the bread was passed, a shared smile during a lute performance, a moment alone when everyone else chased a runaway chicken. Yes, that actually happened in a tale from Burgundy. Sometimes couples found ways to sneak in, extra time together by arranging to walk home from the gathering together, but only if a suitable chaperone accompanied them. A younger sibling, for instance, who was bribed with plum tarts to walk ahead and pretend not to hear. In certain areas, games of forfeits were also used as cover. These were group games where someone who lost had to perform a silly task, singing a song, reciting a rhyme, or occasionally offering a chaste peck on the cheek to someone of the group's choosing. Needless to say, these forfeits were sometimes rigged, and every so often a certain cousin coughed at just the right moment, and a certain cheese knife got passed a little too slowly, and a pair of eyes met across a crust of rye, and the world tilted just slightly, in favor of love. There's something charmingly quaint about all this, but also something very human. Group dating, in all its awkward glory, wasn't just about control. It was also about community, about love as something that belonged not just to the couple, but to the family, the village, the shared story. It meant that when two people did finally walk hand in hand, there were dozens of witnesses ready to say, "We saw it happen, we helped it along, we passed the cheese." So tonight, as we close our eyes and let these gentle images float past, let's not judge the chaperoned courtships too harshly. They may have lacked privacy, but they overflowed with ritual, attention, and care, and they remind us that even in a world of restrictions and rules, the heart is endlessly resourceful, because love, even when supervised, still finds a way to smile through crumbs. The air was still, not with peace but with waiting, with the kind of hush that settles over a town when too many doors have been nailed shut and too few bells ring in the morning. It was the spring of 1349. The Black Death had arrived in Avignon, as it had in Florence and in London and in hundreds of other places where rats and fear made fast companions. Streets emptied, markets stilled. The air was thick with incense and the whisper of prayers. But even then, even in a world gripped by death, love refused to die quietly. Tonight, as the wind softens and you drift toward sleep, we open a fragile letter. The parchment is yellowed, its corners curled. The handwriting is nervous, slanted, a little smudged by what might have been tears, or maybe just rain. It begins, "My dearest Marie, I have not seen your face these 21 days. During the plague years, love letters took on new urgency. They became both lifeline and last words. With entire towns under quarantine and travel often forbidden, writing became the only way to reach the heart of another. Letters were carried by messengers who took great risks, some paid handsomely, others simply motivated by kindness or desperation. In some cases, people tied messages to sticks and left them at town borders, hoping the right eyes would find them. These letters were not always eloquent. In fact, many were messy, rushed, full of misspellings and crossed-out lines, but they were raw and honest, and often heartbreakingly tender. One letter from a stonemason in York to his betrothed, written in 1350, reads, "If you have survived, I wish to marry you on the green hill by the chapel, with a blackbird to sing, for us. If you have not, I shall wait a little while before following." Another, from a young widow in Siena, simply says, "I loved you more than the sweet figs of May. I still do. I always shall. Even if the figs return, and we do not." Not all the letters were sad. Some were humorously defiant. A tailor from Bruges, writing to his beloved who had been sent away to live with cousins, declared, "They say if I touch you, I might perish. I say I would risk it twice if your hands are still warm and your voice still laughs at my clumsy feet." Interestingly, the language of these plague year letters often blurred the line between romantic and spiritual love. With death so close, many writers turned to metaphors of heaven, saints, angels. Some asked for tokens, a scrap of cloth, a ring, a lock of hair, to be buried with them, just in case. Others promised to wait not only until the end of the plague, but until the next life, and still others tried their best to sound romantic while describing their own symptoms. One man wrote, "My love, I ache in the legs, sweat at noon, and cough in the night. But I still dream of your voice in my fever. I think you cure me better than the monks. Powder." In some cities, lovers married quickly without the usual pomp and ceremony, simply to be together before one, or both, fell ill. Priests in masks whispered blessings through windows. Rings were made of ribbon or twine. The kiss was sometimes replaced by a prayer. But there were also those who waited months, even years, for a reunion. And in the waiting, they wrote. Letters became vessels of longing, charting not only affection but survival. A woman in Prague kept a journal letter for her husband, who had been quarantined in another city. She wrote to him every 3 days, though she had no way to send the pages. In one entry, she says, "I made your soup today, the way you like, with leeks and too much salt. I burned it, but I laughed. I hope somewhere you are laughing too." He returned 2 years later. They married under a cherry tree. The journal was read aloud by her sister at the wedding feast. Even the dead received letters. In Florence, it became a common practice for mourners to leave messages on grave markers, often simple, sometimes poetic, occasionally flirtatious in a tragic way. One such note read, "If you can still hear me, I forgive you for stealing my wine, but only if you wait for me." And yet, amidst the sorrow, love endured, not always quietly. There's a wonderful record of a young nun who, after surviving illness, wrote to her childhood friend, "I prayed for you each day, but when I began to get better, I thought perhaps you had stopped praying for me, and I recovered out of sheer annoyance." The letter ends with a request. "When this is over, come bring me figs, and your terrible singing. I miss both terribly." As we lie here now, wrapped in warmth, far from the scent of plague herbs and the shadow of bells tolling in morning, it is worth remembering that love does not fear dark times. It may falter, it may grieve, but it does not vanish. It writes itself, onto walls, into dirt, on the back of ration slips. It borrows the trembling hand of someone feverish. It finds its way into sealed envelopes, tied with string and tucked into bread baskets. It speaks even when no voice can. And in that way, love. Letters from the plague years remind us of something gentle but fierce. When the world stops, the heart still beats. The armor gleams, though faintly dulled by dust from the road. A banner flaps gently in the breeze. And beneath a steel helmet, hot, heavy, and slightly itchy, a knight closes his eyes and murmurs something, not quite a prayer, not quite a poem. It's a promise. To serve, to protect, and most importantly tonight, to love with honor. As we drift into this part of our story, let us walk softly through the world of chivalry. Not the Hollywood version, no charging horses or flying dragons, but the quieter, more intricate codes that governed a knight's behavior, especially in matters of the heart. Because while swordplay may have won wars, it was honor that won hearts. Let's begin with the code of chivalry, that storied set of ideals that knights were expected to uphold. Loyalty, courage, generosity, humility, and yes, courtly love. At first glance, these values might seem straightforward, but when you look closer, especially through the lens of romance, things get wonderfully complicated. You see, a knight's love wasn't just expected to be pure. It was supposed to be suffering. Yes, painful, longing, noble, the best kind of. Love, according to the chivalric poets, was the kind that couldn't be fulfilled. A knight pining for a lady he could never have was not considered foolish. He was considered admirable. Take Sir Gawain, for instance, a knight of Arthurian legend. In many tales, Gawain is the embodiment of chivalric love. He performs great deeds for ladies, writes poetry in tents, and once, famously, refuses to kiss a noblewoman because he's already vowed his heart elsewhere. She offers him wine, music, even a velvet cushion. He refuses everything but conversation and a polite bow. Now, whether you find that charming or frustrating probably depends on how long it's been since you last read a love story. But in medieval terms, this was the height of virtue. These vows of loyalty were not always abstract. Knights often swore literal oaths of love, sometimes spoken aloud before others, sometimes written in beautifully tortured prose on scraps of vellum. These oaths promised devotion, secrecy, and service, not just to the lady's heart, but to her reputation. A knight might say, "I pledge to uphold her name as I would my own blade. May no insult pass without my answer, and no glance from her go unmarked." These promises were often signed in blood or sealed with wax, and in many cases kept for life. Some knights went even further, adopting tokens of their lady's favor. A ribbon tied to the arm, a scarf tucked beneath the breastplate. One knight reportedly carried a small silk slipper into battle, sewn inside the lining of his helmet. When asked why, he replied, so that my head may be turned only by her. It's unclear if this improved his swordsmanship, but the poetry of it certainly endured. And these gestures weren't just symbolic, they carried real social weight. In tournaments, those theatrical, chaotic clashes of knights meant more for display than danger. A knight would often dedicate his performance to a lady. If he won, her name was spoken aloud before the crowd. If he lost, well, she might still receive a poem or a song as consolation. One scribe recorded a list of tournament dedications in which Lady Aveline of Sussex was honored 12 times in one season. She was reportedly unmoved by most of them, though she did accept a fruit basket from the runner-up. But of course, not every knight lived up to the code. There were scandals, affairs, betrayals. One knight in Brittany promised love to 3 different women in the same year, and was caught when 2 of them embroidered the same verse onto his tunic. Another knight tried to escape an engagement by claiming a sudden vow of silence, only to be overheard singing love songs in the tavern 2 weeks later. Chivalry may have been a code, but it was still interpreted through very human hearts. Still, many knights did honor their promises with deep sincerity. A quiet example. Sir Estienne, a lesser-known knight from Gascony whose journals were found centuries later in the ruins of a chapel. Among records of grain taxes and repairs to his horse's armor were pages filled with letters to a woman named Clara. Clara never appears in historical records. She may have been a servant, or a widow, or simply someone who captured his heart. He writes, "I ride with your name in my breath and your kindness in my reins. If I should fall, know that my last thought shall not be of glory, but of the way you smiled that morning near the apple tree." There's no record of whether Clara ever replied, but the letters were kept carefully folded in a box lined with dried leaves. So what does all this mean? It means that for all the armor, all the rules, and all the complicated poetry, knights were still just people in love. People trying to prove themselves, to protect what they cherished, to express affection in a world that often limited how it could be shown. And though time has moved on, some things remain. We still admire loyalty. We still value promises. And sometimes, even now, we fall in love with the idea of someone before we've ever truly held their hand. As you lie back tonight and let your thoughts drift toward dreams, perhaps imagine this: a candlelit hall, a folded oath in a leather pouch, a knight not at war but at a writing desk, crafting a sentence so careful it might last forever, not to impress but to honor, because real love, like chivalry, asks not just for words, but for quiet, noble acts. Before the age of text messages, heart emojis, and whispered phone calls in the dark, there was another way to send a message, one that required no words at all. It drifted lightly on the air. It lingered in the folds of cloth. It turned heads in chapel pews and caused hearts to flutter in crowded marketplaces. It was sent. Tonight, as the world grows still and shadows lengthen like satin ribbons, we turn to the story of medieval perfumes, not simply as cosmetics but as instruments of romance, as intimate as a touch and as daring as a love letter sent on the breeze. The medieval world was far more fragrant than we might imagine, though not always in the ways we hope. Between tanneries, chamber pots, and open-air markets, the smells of daily life could be assertive. In such a setting, a pleasant scent became more than a luxury. It became a distinction, a signature, even a weapon of the heart. And so, those who could afford it turned to perfumed oils, pomanders, and sachets. Perfumes were made by apothecaries and spice merchants, using ingredients sourced from as far as Arabia and the Levant. A single vial might contain rose petals soaked in honeyed wine, lavender crushed into almond oil, cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove infused in vinegar, and in more extravagant cases, ambergris, a strange and precious substance from the belly of a whale, said to hold scent like a heart holds hope. But perfume wasn't just about smelling nice. It sent messages. A woman who wore rose and rosemary was believed to be declaring herself faithful and hopeful. A man who dabbed on musk and sage might be subtly signaling confidence, or trying a bit too hard. Some used scent to express status, the rarer the spice, the wealthier the wearer. But others used it as a kind of coded flirtation. A noble woman might carry a pomander, a decorative ball filled with herbs, on a chain at her waist. With each sway of her hips, a puff of scent escaped, delicate and deliberate. If she passed you twice in the same evening, and the scent changed from lavender to sandalwood, it might have meant something. More daring lovers used scented gloves to communicate desire. As we explored earlier, gloves were tokens of affection, but when perfumed, they became intimate beyond touch. A knight might wear gloves gifted by his lady, steeped in her favorite scent. It was said that to inhale them before battle was to carry her presence onto the field. There's even a record from Florence of a young scribe who wrote an entire poem about a pair of lavender-scented gloves left on his writing table, by mistake. He read into the gesture so deeply that he confessed his feelings in return. The gloves were actually his sister's. The confession, however, was accepted. Some communities believed certain scents stirred the heart. Civet, derived from a gland of the civet cat, was believed to arouse passion. Myrrh was used in spiritual rituals, but also hinted at longing without end. Lily and iris were worn by those seeking to appear modest, yet tempting. And then there were the lovers' sachets, tiny fabric pouches filled with herbs and worn beneath clothing. These were personal and often secret, sewn into seams or tied to undergarments. One popular blend, violet, clove, crushed mint, and a shaving of apple bark. It was known as the sweet wait and believed to strengthen patience in love. But scent wasn't always subtle. In the grand halls of the aristocracy, women would spray or dab their handkerchiefs with perfume and accidentally drop them in front of a desired suitor. If he picked it up, inhaled and smiled, a silent connection was formed. If he wrinkled his nose or ignored it altogether, well, the handkerchief could always be claimed as lost and never spoken of again. Monks, interestingly, had a complex relationship with perfume. While many religious orders discouraged vanity, they couldn't ignore the medicinal and emotional power of scent. Lavender, chamomile, and rosewater were often used in abbeys to calm the mind and comfort the sick. Some even believed that the smell of virtue could be detected by scent. One chronicle describes a nun who smelled of lilies even when none were in bloom. Whether metaphor or miracle, the idea that goodness had a fragrance was deeply rooted. Scented ink also made its way into love letters. Some lovers steeped their writing materials in floral waters, so the note itself would carry a trace of the writer's presence. It's said that certain letters, when opened, released such delicate aromas that the recipient blushed before reading a single word. One German courtier kept a perfumed letter in his boot for 20 years. When it was found after his death, it still smelled faintly of orange blossom. And yes, there were failures. A butcher's son in Rouen once attempted to create his own perfume by boiling onions in cider and straining them through linen. He gave a small bottle to the girl he admired. She sniffed it once, promptly sneezed, and married a candlemaker instead. But for every poorly executed blend, there were 100 small triumphs, moments when scent did what words could not. When a passing fragrance made someone turn their head. When a kiss was remembered not by taste but by the way someone smelled in the moonlight. So tonight, as you breathe slowly and the world quiets down, imagine a narrow street at dusk. A figure walks by in a wool cloak. You catch the faintest trace of rose and rain. You turn, but they are gone. And yet, you remember. Because scent, like love, lingers, even after the words fade. Picture a courtyard at twilight. The lanterns have just been lit, casting pools of golden light on worn stone. Somewhere in the background, a lute begins to play. Soft, searching notes, like a voice too shy to speak. Then, the singing begins. It's not grand or operatic. It's gentle, almost conversational. A story wrapped in melody, a secret offered in rhyme. The minstrel has arrived, and so has love, dressed in verse and velvet. In medieval Europe, long before radio, playlists, or even consistent spelling, music was the language of emotion, and the people who mastered that language, the minstrels, the troubadours, the jongleurs, were as much a part of the romantic landscape as scented letters and carved pears. They wandered from castle to tavern, from village green to noble court, carrying with them songs of longing, of loss, of laughter, and most of all of love. But they weren't just entertainers. No, in the world of medieval courtship, minstrels were messengers, sometimes literal ones, delivering love letters disguised as lyrics. Other times they were emotional translators, turning clumsy affection into something smooth and poetic. A young knight, for example, might commission a minstrel to compose a song in honor of a lady he admired. The knight would provide details, her eyes, the way she laughed, her fondness for gooseberry jam, and the minstrel would weave these into a ballad. Then, on an agreed evening, the minstrel would perform near her window. Not too loud, lest the neighbors complain, but just loud enough that the lady and perhaps her curious maid could hear. If she approved, she might drop a token from the window, a scarf, a coin, a flower wrapped in ribbon. If not, well, the minstrel always had backup songs for general entertainment. This role wasn't without danger. In one amusing tale from Normandy, a minstrel named Hugo was hired to serenade a merchant's daughter on behalf of a timid young suitor. Hugo's song was heartfelt, well-written, and slightly too effective. The girl fell in love with Hugo. She eloped with him 3 days later, leaving behind a basket of pears and a very confused merchant. But for the most part, minstrels navigated these romantic entanglements with tact and humor. They were often viewed as neutral vessels above the usual rules of courtship. They could speak truths that others couldn't, couching bold observations in rhyme and meter. A line that might sound presumptuous in prose could be forgiven, even adored when sung. One famous song from Aquitaine includes the line, "If my heart offends by beating near thee, let it learn to beat in silence, but still in thy direction." It's not subtle, but oh, how sweet it sounds with a lute. Minstrels also tested the waters for nervous lovers. At feasts or festivals, a minstrel might sing a teasing song, dropping hints about a secret admirer. They'd watch for reactions, the blush, the glance, the flicker of recognition. If the response was positive, the admirer might make their move. If not, the song could always be passed off as fiction. This tactic became so popular that some minstrels were referred to as heart scouts. They charted emotional terrain the way others mapped rivers, carefully with song as their compass. Of course, not all their performances were for nobles. Minstrels also played in taverns, fields, and on market days, offering tales of love that ranged from the noble to the absurdly hilarious. One preserved verse tells the story of a baker who tried to woo a woman by baking her face into every loaf. The refrain, translated loosely, is, "She liked the bread, disliked the nose, and married one with cleaner toes." Songs like these served as cautionary tales, but also reminders that love is, at its heart, deeply human. And like any good performer, a minstrel knew how to read the room. Some songs were dreamy and slow, designed for longing looks across a crowded hall. Others were upbeat and playful, perfect for those tentative first steps toward affection. There were melodies for stolen kisses and harmonies for aching goodbyes. There were even duets, where a minstrel would sing both parts of a conversation, portraying lovers as they argued, flirted, or schemed. And when two minstrels met in the same town, oh, then it was time for a song duel, a playful competition of rhymes and rhythm, often with romantic stakes. The winner was usually decided by audience applause, or whichever one had the prettier boots. Minstrels were not always free-roaming. Some were kept in noble courts, employed full-time to provide music, entertainment, and emotional commentary on daily life. They wrote custom songs for birthdays, weddings, and of course, courtship milestones. In one court in Provence, a minstrel was tasked with composing a new verse each time a certain nobleman received a glove from his lady. The glove collection grew large. The verses eventually ran out of rhymes for dove, but even in their most theatrical moments, minstrels gave something precious. They gave voice to the inarticulate heart. They turned love into something others could hear, remember, and hum on lonely evenings. Their songs were not always perfect. Their notes sometimes faltered, but the emotion behind them, that quiet, urgent hope of being loved, rang clear. So tonight, as your thoughts begin to slow and settle, perhaps imagine a minstrel at your door. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft voice with a gentle lute, offering a melody stitched from glances, memory, and maybe just a little mischief. A song just for you. Because sometimes love doesn't need a declaration. It only needs to be sung. It is a quiet evening. Somewhere a bell tolls in the distance. Footsteps echo on a stone corridor, then fade, and behind a carved wooden door, lit only by the golden shimmer of a single candle, someone unrolls a piece of cloth. Embroidered on its hem, just barely visible in the firelight, are 4 tiny blue stitches. Pare FM plus. To most, meaningless. To the right eyes, it is everything. A confession, a promise, a map of the heart. Welcome to the world of forbidden love and secret codes, the hidden language of lovers who had to find a way when words were too dangerous, too loud, or too forbidden to speak. In medieval society, love wasn't always allowed. Sometimes, it was a matter of class, a noble falling for a servant, or a merchant's daughter caught gazing too long at a traveling knight. Other times it was religion, politics, or even family feuds that stood between two hearts. And when letters could be intercepted, when words could be overheard, lovers turned to symbols, signs, and codes. Tiny rebellions stitched into linen, carved into chapel benches, or baked into bread crusts. Let's begin with the simplest of them all, initials. Not written plainly, of course. That would be foolish. But hidden, within the border of a handkerchief, at the edge of a painting, inside the looping tail of a capital letter in a songbook. Some even used runes or ancient alphabets to disguise names, spelling them out backwards, or in mirror form. In a famous example from Bavaria, a tapestry was discovered with the phrase "Ygritte loves Balthazar" encoded in the stitching pattern of ivy leaves. Each twist of the vine represented a letter. It took historians a decade to notice, and another to decode. The original recipients likely knew in an instant. Then there were the flower codes. In an era when gardens were often the only private place two people might meet without raising suspicion, flowers became both scenery and signal. A white lily left at the gate might mean, "I await your answer." A violet pressed into a prayer book could whisper, "I will be true." A sprig of rue tied with red thread, "They cannot stop me from loving you." In some cases, entire bouquets were crafted messages, each flower a word, each stem a syllable. A young apothecary in York was said to have courted a baker's daughter entirely through these floral missives. Their courtship lasted 3 years and involved 87 different plants. They married under an arbor of mint and forget-me-nots. More ambitious lovers turned to visual codes. These might include knots tied into belts, symbolizing waiting, connection, or secrecy. Patterns on clothing cuffs, like a heart with a broken sword or a bird flying from a cage, or drawings hidden inside books. Tiny marginalia sketched by scribes with romantic flair in. Some monasteries, where silence was the rule and letters forbidden, monks developed entire silent languages of glances and gestures. A certain tug of the sleeve, a tap on the shoulder, a pause at a window. Not all of these were romantic, of course, but some surely were. After all, the heart doesn't care much for vows of silence. And then there were carvings. Oh, the carvings. In churches, in cloisters, in castle corners, lovers etched their stories in stone. Often just initials, but sometimes full verses, scratched hurriedly by candlelight or chisel tip. In one village church in northern France, scholars found a medieval love poem carved into a pew. She sang at dusk. "I dared to dream, but dreams are thorns on morning's seam. Still I write her name beside my own, so the saints may know my heart has flown. No one knows who wrote it, but someone once sang at dusk. Some of the most ingenious codes appeared. In baking and embroidery, bakers would shape crusts into hearts or braid them with symbols meaningful only to the recipient. One tale tells of a pastry with 3 cherries arranged in a triangle, secret shorthand for "Meet me at the 3rd bell behind the orchard." Embroiderers, meanwhile, stitched love into every fold. One noblewoman from Navarre wove messages into her sleeves, each thread color corresponding to a letter. Her lover, a scribe, read them from across the room. When they were discovered, she claimed it was just a prayer. The colors, she said, were coincidental. The bishop did not believe her, but the scribe did. It's tempting to romanticize all of this, to see secret codes as the height of noble passion. But in truth, they were also born of necessity. Forbidden love was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. To be caught could mean ruin, exile, even death. So lovers hid their hearts in pattern and shadow, trusting that the one they loved could see the unseen, could read the invisible ink between the stitches, and often they did. What's remarkable is how deeply creative people became when forced into silence. They invented languages. They carved worlds out of brief glances and shared symbols. They trusted that love, even quiet and hidden, was worth the effort, even worth the risk. So tonight, as we close our eyes and drift toward dreams, perhaps we might wonder, what messages live around us, unseen? What words go unspoken, yet understood? And if someone left you a single violet in your book, would you know what it meant? In a world of whispers, love learned to speak anyway, and that perhaps is the boldest code of all. The morning fog is just beginning to lift from the village roofs. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys. Roosters crow without coordination, and bread rises in communal ovens. And down a winding lane, past a coop full of noisy hens, a knock sounds on a wooden door. The door opens. A face appears, lined with years, wrapped in a woolen shawl, eyes twinkling. It is her, the matchmaker, and she knows everything. In the medieval world, matchmaking wasn't just a profession, it was often a combination of local authority, emotional intelligence, and theatrical performance. Whether officially appointed or informally relied upon, matchmakers served as the quiet architects behind many a marriage. These were not simply romantic agents, they were social engineers, tasked with maintaining the delicate balance between love, family, land, and gossip. And oh, the gossip was plentiful. Matchmakers came in many forms. In Jewish communities, they were called shachanim, learned, observant, and often deeply respected. In Christian towns and villages, the role might fall to a widowed aunt, a midwife, or even the village herbalist, who always seemed to know which lad visited which kitchen after dark. They were usually older, though not always, and rarely married themselves. It gave them a kind of neutrality, a freedom to navigate between families without suspicion, and most importantly, they knew who had cows, who had land, who had debts, and who, quietly, sheepishly, was in love with the cooper's apprentice. Let's travel now to a small hamlet outside Ghent. A young man named Peter is of marrying age. He has a strong back, a steady trade, and a rather awkward habit of giggling at the sight of ribbons. His mother is worried, so she sends for Aunt Elske, who lives on the edge of the village and is known to keep a notebook full of initials, birth, dates, and cow counts. Elske arrives, eats a heel of bread, and listens. She nods, frowns, asks one question. Does he snore? Then she sets to work. Her first visit is to the home of Magriette, a weaver's daughter with clever hands and a penchant for quoting love ballads. They talk of yarn and yeast, but in between, Elske drops small, careful mentions. Peter is learning to carve spoons now. He built a shed for his neighbor last week, just for the practice. They say he has a kind heart and very neat boots. Magriette smiles, just slightly. The next day, Elske arranges a group visit to the village feast. Magriette is invited. So is Peter. They sit 3 benches apart. By dessert, it's 2. By winter, they're married. Elski receives a basket of pears and a new wool shawl for her efforts. Not all matchmaking was so smooth. Sometimes it involved negotiation, intervention, and, when all else failed, mild trickery. One tale from the Dordogne region tells of a matchmaker who staged a lost goat encounter. To bring two stubborn young people together, she sent the boy to search, then arranged for the girl to be walking nearby Quirium with a goat. They met, argued about the goat, then married 3 months later. The goat was never found. In other cases, matchmakers used objects as tools of persuasion. Woven ribbon passed from one household to another, a batch of sweet buns, too many for one family, perhaps share with the neighbors. And sometimes, a lock of hair baked into a biscuit, or a few drops of rose water sprinkled on a borrowed kerchief. Was it manipulation? Maybe. Was it effective? Often. Matchmakers weren't just pairing personalities. They were matching timing, opportunity, family politics, and emotional readiness. They could spot love before it fully bloomed, like a baker knowing when the dough has risen just enough. And while some focused purely on practical unions, others had a softer side. There's record of one matchmaker in Wales who refused to arrange any match where the sigh of the girl did not rise when his name was said. She had rules, and a bell, and possibly a flask of cider tucked in her apron. But not all matchmaking was well received. Sometimes the couple resisted. Sometimes the families protested, and sometimes the matchmaker's suggestion was simply absurd. One infamous case in Norfolk involved a matchmaker who suggested a 60-year-old widower and a 16-year-old beekeeper. He offered honey. She offered a firm no. The matchmaker apologized with a basket of apples and the promise of a better option. She delivered 2 weeks later. This time, same age, fewer bees, success. Perhaps the most curious thing about medieval matchmakers is how quietly influential they were. They rarely took credit. They claimed no magic, but again and again, when asked how a couple came together, villagers would shrug and say, "Oh, Elska was involved, I think," and that was enough. So tonight, as we close our eyes, let us picture her. A figure hunched over a fire, murmuring names into the steam of soup. A clever, patient hand tying 2 pieces of ribbon together. A knock on a door that changes a life. Matchmakers may not have written the sonnets or fought the duels, but they made love possible when hearts were shy and customs strict. They were the bridge, the spark, and the smiling woman at the edge of the room, watching, as 2 hands slowly reach for the same cup. In a quiet hall lined with tapestries, 2 men sit across a long oak table. Between them, a scroll, 2 cups of wine, a pouch heavy with coins, and, most invisibly, a young woman's future. Outside, she stands in the garden, nervously pinching rosemary between her fingers. She is thinking about his eyes. They are thinking about his income. Welcome to the world of dowries. That curious intersection where love meets ledger, and where romance, however warm, is seldom complete without a formal tally of goats, linens, and land. A dowry, in medieval Europe, was a contribution, usually from the bride's family, given to the groom or his household upon marriage. It could take many forms: coins, livestock, textiles, land tools. Even entire vineyards, the dowry was not always viewed as a price for the bride, but rather as a kind of economic insurance, a way of ensuring she had security in the marriage, and should anything go awry, a safety net upon widowhood. But of course, human hearts are not so neatly insured. Negotiating a dowry was often a deeply theatrical affair. Both sides would feign modesty while subtly inflating their worth. A father might say, "We have a small orchard," knowing full well it spanned half the hill. The groom's uncle might insist he only seeks companionship, while casually laying out receipts from last year's wool profits. And in the background, often just out of earshot, stood the bride and groom, quietly wondering if affection could be priced in barrels of pickled fish. Sometimes the negotiations turned heated. In Milan, a record survives of a dispute where a bride's father offered a pair of oxen, 3 bolts. Of dyed linen, a silver comb, and a cask of cherry wine. The groom's side countered, "The oxen are slow, the linen is poorly woven, and the wine tastes of vinegar." It escalated. The wedding was postponed. The oxen were eventually replaced. The wine stayed. But not all dowry dramas were tragic. Many were wonderfully ridiculous. One story from Brittany tells of a woman whose dowry included a small flock of sheep, one of which developed a habit of chasing the groom around the property. When asked if he'd still marry her, he replied, "Only if the sheep stays outside the bedroom." They were wed the next morning. The sheep attended. In some cultures, dowries were recorded with ceremony. In parts of Spain and Italy, dowry contracts were read aloud in front of witnesses and signed with wax seals. They listed each item, sometimes with poetic flourish. 2 chests of pine, filled with linens smelling of rosemary and sunlight. In other areas, dowry chests were elaborately carved and passed down through generations. These cassoni, as they were called in Florence, were symbols of both wealth and legacy. Some are still displayed in museums today, full of lions, doves, and painted garden scenes. But here's the truth. No one embroidered into the cushions. For many women, their dowry determined who would even consider marrying them. A woman with a large dowry could choose from many suitors, even those above her station. A woman with little, no matter how charming or capable, might struggle to secure a match. This imbalance led to a quiet but powerful cottage industry of dowry boosting. Some families would save for years, take out loans, or even send daughters to convents, not always for religious calling, but because the church required no dowry, and when a family had multiple daughters, things got competitive. There are letters between sisters that range from gently bitter to full theatrical despair. Mother has given Clara the goose feather pillows and the tapestry. I suppose I shall marry the baker's apprentice and sleep with hay. Others took it more creatively. One woman in York is rumored to have faked a larger dowry by borrowing furniture and coins from neighbors the week before the suitor's visit. The deception was discovered, but the suitor was so impressed by her resourcefulness that he married her anyway. The chest was empty, but her mind was full. Not all societies handled dowries the same way. In some Jewish and Byzantine communities, the groom offered what's called a bride price, a kind of upfront security to be returned if the marriage ended. This offered a slightly different power dynamic, where the man's promise carried financial weight from the beginning. Still, the principle remained. Love came with contracts, sometimes fair, sometimes lopsided, always complicated, and yet, many found real affection despite the calculations. There are countless accounts of couples who began as good bargains and ended as great loves. One record from a small town in Wales tells of a man who refused a wealthy dowry in favor of marrying a shepherd's daughter. When asked why, he said, "She has no linen, but she laughed at my poetry. That is enough." They lived modestly, raised bees, and became locally famous for their spring honey. So what can we take from this balance of heart and coin? Perhaps it's this. In a world where even love was notarized, people still found ways to make it real. They joked, they bargained, they dreamed, and sometimes they turned a practical match into a lifelong partnership, not in spite of the dowry, but because they chose to build something far richer than money ever measured. As you rest tonight, perhaps imagine not a treasure chest, but 2 hands, empty, open, offered. Sometimes the most generous dowry is simply showing up with love in your heart and a willingness to share it, even if the wine tastes like vinegar. Imagine this, a busy town square. Bells tolling the hour, children chasing each other through puddles, merchants calling out prices, and then she walks by. Her cloak is crimson, her gloves are doeskin, the hem of her dress swishes with just enough flare to catch the sunlight, and the man selling apples across the way forgets his own name for a moment. She says nothing. She doesn't need to. Her clothes are already speaking. In the Middle Ages, fashion was more than fabric. It was a signal, a performance. a message to be read by those who knew how to look. And when it came to romance, clothing became a carefully constructed language, full of hints, hopes, and occasionally hilarious exaggeration. Let's begin with color. Every hue carried meaning, some of it spiritual, some political, but much of it personal. Red was passion, daring, a hint of I'm available and not afraid to be noticed. Blue, particularly deep lapis blue, spoke of loyalty and quiet devotion. Green, especially worn in spring, was flirtatious, playful, and sometimes even scandalous. One London preacher famously warned his congregation to beware the girl in green, she dances with the devil's toes. A woman might wear a green sash to suggest openness to courtship. A man might line his cloak with red silk, just subtly visible at the edges. These weren't just aesthetic choices. They were romantic strategies. Fabric, too, mattered deeply. Wool was common, warm, and practical, but dyed wool in rich colors signaled resources. Linen, often worn beneath other layers, could be glimpsed at the cuffs or collar, a flash of whiteness suggesting cleanliness, softness, and attention to detail. But for those truly intent on impressing, silk. Imported at great cost and often regulated by sumptuary laws, silk whispered, not just wealth, but desire to be desired. It shimmered, it clung. It rustled with every movement like a secret waiting to be shared. One Italian suitor in the 14th century wore an entire tunic of red gold silk to his beloved's window. She described him as a rooster in full sunrise. He took it as a compliment. And then there were the accessories. A hat tilted just so a ribbon tied to a sleeve. A belt worn slightly off-center. Each detail said something. A loose belt often hinted at romantic availability. Tied tightly, spoken for gloves as we've seen were full of meaning, but so too were shoes. And oh, the shoes. In certain periods, men wore poulaines, long, pointy shoes with tips that curled up dramatically. The longer the point, the bolder the statement. Some were so exaggerated that they required laces tied to the knees for support. A chronicler from Burgundy noted, "A man with feet like harpoons seeks not a bride, but a battle." Nonetheless, they were popular among those hoping to impress. Women, meanwhile, had their own coded choices. A hood pushed back just slightly could suggest interest. A lace bodice with embroidery often carried secret messages, names, dates, or symbols stitched in fine thread, and the act of removing one glove slowly with grace, a small public spell cast upon a watching heart. Of course, not everyone appreciated the fashion of flirtation. Moralists railed against vanity and velvet. Priests gave sermons on carnal cloaks and sinful seams. One abbot banned the color yellow entirely after 3 weddings and 2 elopements occurred in the same week, all involving girls in yellow dresses. But the people dressed on because love has always found a way to wear what it wants. Interestingly, many romantic encounters began not with words, but with clothing adjustments. A man might offer to help a lady fasten a cloak pin. A woman might gently tug a stray thread from a suitor's sleeve. These small gestures created intimacy, often more thrilling than conversation. A young nobleman once confessed in a letter, "She touched my cuff." Only that. And yet I did not sleep for 3 nights, imagining the warmth of her hand. Sometimes the less fabric between fingers and skin, the more electrifying the moment. In rural areas, flirtation took on a different texture. Clothing might be simpler, but still full of intent. A girl might embroider a flower onto her apron, not just for beauty, but to signal affection. A boy might carve his initials into the wooden toggles of his cloak, hoping someone would notice. And during harvest festivals, wearing someone else's shawl, just briefly, was often a public declaration of interest, especially if the shawl smelled faintly of lavender. Fashion also provided cover for the exchange of tokens. A ring slipped into a glove, a note pinned beneath a sleeve. In one delightful case, a woman sewed a tiny pouch inside the hem of her dress, where her lover would secretly place clover each time they met. She collected the clovers for 7 months before their engagement. Her dress reportedly rustled with happiness. So tonight, as you rest beneath your own soft layers, think of those who came before, threading love into every seam, wrapping hope around every color. They knew what we still know. That love, before it is spoken, is worn, and sometimes the boldest declaration is simply showing up in just the right shade of green. It is dusk in a cloistered garden. The stone walls glow faintly with the last light of day. Somewhere nearby, a fountain trickles. Birds rustle in the ivy. A fig tree leans just slightly, as though listening. And beneath its branches, two figures sit, barely touching, barely speaking, just close enough that a sleeve brushes against a sleeve, just far enough to deny everything, if someone were to ask. This is not a public square, not a bustling market. This is the hidden world of garden rendezvous, the secret stage where medieval lovers carved out stolen moments among roses, herbs, and carved stone. In a time when privacy was rare and chaperones plentiful, monastic cloisters, manor gardens, and chapel courtyards offered rare pockets of seclusion. Though not designed for romance, they were perfect for it. Quiet, walled in, sacred, and thus less likely to be invaded by nosy relatives. And full of symbolism, new growth, whispered prayers. The soft surrender of petals to wind. Many gardens were laid out in quadrangles, with paths designed for meditation. But lovers found their own use for these lanes. A single lap together under cover of vespers might be enough to set the heart racing for days. Let's travel now to a convent outside Toulouse. It is 1372. A novice named Isabeau has been corresponding with a young musician from the nearby abbey. Her cousin delivers notes under the guise of laundry. They never speak aloud. But one evening a month after evening prayer, they each walk to the outer wall of the garden and sit on opposite sides of a hedgerow. They cannot see each other, but they know the other is there. She hums a tune. He strums a matching chord. And, for an hour, surrounded by time and moonlight, they exist in the same moment. Stories like this are scattered throughout the letters and legends of the Middle Ages. Some are tragic, others end in marriage. Many exist only as soft rumors, a pair of initials carved into a stone bench, a lost ribbon found tangled in a rose bush. Gardens, after all, are good at keeping secrets, especially cloistered ones. In wealthier households, garden architecture itself became a tool for romance. Winding paths, hidden alcoves, stone benches placed just so, inviting pause. A well-placed vine could create a shaded archway. A hedge could shield whispers from passing eyes. Even the plants were chosen with care. Lavender for peace, rosemary for remembrance, chamomile for patience. And of course roses, especially white for purity, red for passion, and pink for tender hope. Many lovers met at a specific flower bed, using its blooming cycle as a private calendar. When the iris bloom, I shall be there. But not all meetings were accidental or natural. Some were orchestrated with skill worthy of a playwright. A servant might be paid to leave the gate unlatched. A friar might conveniently go inside just as a young scholar accidentally took a wrong turn past the chapel garden. In one famous tale from Aragon, a girl feigned an interest in botany to secure time near the cathedral's medicinal plot. Her object of affection, a reluctant herb apprentice, spent the next month pretending to lose tools near her. They were eventually caught in the basil and married shortly after. Many gardens featured stone benches, often inscribed or marked. Over time, these became quiet landmarks. A line scratched with a pin. Here I waited. A heart carved beside a Latin prayer. A poem, faint and unfinished, lost to moss and weather. Some cloisters had walls so old, the same bench may have hosted 5 centuries of secret romances. One French monk wrote, "I sit where others have whispered, and I whisper still. Love and ivy never forget where to climb." Perhaps most touching were the rituals of parting. Since these garden meetings were brief, often monthly or even less, lovers devised parting customs. A hand brushed 3 times on stone, a flower left, behind a glove tied to the back of a bench with a single knot. These small actions became the only way to say, "I was here, I waited, I will return." There is something sacred about these meetings. not because of their location, but because of their delicacy. No grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, just a shared breath between two walls, beneath vines and sky. In a world of rules and eyes, these gardens were sanctuaries not only for prayer but for possibility. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine it. A quiet garden, a worn stone bench, the scent of rosemary in the air, two hearts, no words, just the gentle rhythm of hope growing like ivy along ancient stone. The hall is full. Candles flicker against dark wooden beams. A clerk shuffles parchments. A judge rubs his temples. And at the center of it all, standing stiffly, fingers clenched in her apron, is a young woman named Annalyn. She has brought her suitor to court. Why? Because he promised to marry her, and then, quite rudely, proposed to someone else instead. This isn't a lover's quarrel. This is a legal case. And in the Middle Ages, such things were not uncommon. Medieval Europe, despite its swords and saints and serfs, had an unexpectedly litigious heart when it came to love. There were no dating apps, no prenups, but there were contracts, verbal oaths, and plenty of expectations. And when those were broken, well, sometimes love found its way into the courtroom. These cases, known in Latin as causa matrimoni promissi, cases of promised marriage, were handled by ecclesiastical courts under the authority of the church. Because in medieval Europe, marriage wasn't just personal. It was sacramental, and so was heartbreak. Here's how it worked. If one person claimed that another had promised marriage, especially in front of witnesses, and then backed out, they could sue. Yes, sue. The court would investigate. Were there witnesses? Was there a gift exchanged, a ring, a glove, a ribbon? Had there been more physical signs of commitment? If the answer to enough of these was yes, the court could compel the couple to marry, not out of romance, but out of honor. Sometimes these trials were dramatic. One case from Bruges involved a baker's son who gave his beloved a braided loaf and said, "Let this be our bond." She took it seriously. He did not. When he tried to wed the butcher's daughter instead, the first girl's aunt took him to court. The judge ruled in her favor. They were wed the following spring. The wedding cake was appropriately bread, but not all cases ended in marriage. Some ended in public shaming, financial penalties, or excommunication. In one French case, a woman presented 4 love letters in court, each signed with a poetic nickname, each promising eternal unity. The man claimed the letters were jokes. The court disagreed. He was fined and forced to stand before the church in sackcloth, holding a sign that read, "I mocked the promise of the heart." One assumes he didn't do it again. Then there were the cases involving disputed engagement gifts. Rings were rare and expensive. More common were gloves, brooches, belts, or even roasted almonds wrapped in linen. One jilted suitor tried to sue for the return of a stuffed goose he had given with intention. The goose was eaten. The judge ruled it symbolic and let it go. Interestingly, many of these trials were full of poetry and performance. Lovers quoted each other's words back with flair. Some presented songs as evidence, claiming they were written in earnest, not jest. Others submitted pieces of clothing, embroidered initials, or even hair tokens, braids given and bound in ribbons. These tokens, while touching, were rarely enough on their own. But when combined with witness testimony, very persuasive. The church, for its part, tried to walk a line. It wanted to uphold the seriousness of marital vows, but also protect against forced unions. They emphasized the importance of mutual consent, that both parties had to agree freely to the marriage. This led to some thorny situations. In one case, 2 people promised to marry as a joke, in play, as the record says. Years later, one of them tried to claim it was binding. The court ruled against him, but warned others not to jest with holy things, a medieval way of saying, don't propose as a prank. And then, there were the truly strange cases, like the one involving a man who claimed he had been bewitched into promising marriage. His defense?
She gave me a pastry with strange herbs. I spoke her name and forgot my own. The judge asked for a sample of the pastry. It was pronounced delicious, but not magical. Case dismissed. All of this may sound quaint, or overly formal, or impossibly
Romantic, but it tells us something simple, that even then love was messy. And people, flawed, hopeful, impulsive, sought fairness when hearts were bruised. They wanted promises kept. They wanted affection honored. They wanted, above all, not to be made fools of in the eyes of their community. So tonight, as you lie, in stillness picture a courtroom lit by candlelight, a parchment being unrolled, a voice trembling slightly as it says, "He told me I was the only one, and I believed him." The judge sighs, the clerk writes, and somewhere behind them all, love waits, nervous, stubborn, and still, somehow, hoping for justice. Every year on the 14th of February, hearts bloom across windows, shops, and inboxes. Flowers are sold, chocolates exchanged, notes passed, poems read, glances shared. And somewhere, often in small print or vague conversation, a name is invoked. Valentine. Saint Valentine, to be precise. But who was he? A romantic priest? A martyr for love? A man with a fondness for heart-shaped correspondence? As we settle into the soft hush of this evening's tale, let us explore the wonderfully confusing, faintly comic, and utterly endearing story of how one mysterious saint came to symbolize all things amorous. To begin, we must admit a truth. There is no single Saint Valentine. In fact, there were at least 3 Valentines venerated by the Church in the early centuries, each a Christian martyr, each living during the Roman Empire, each with stories wrapped in miracle and mystery. One was a priest in Rome, another, a bishop in Terni, and a third, possibly an entirely different person altogether. Their tales were stitched together over centuries like a medieval quilt, full of holes, bright threads, and unmatched corners. And yet somehow, from this patchwork, a legend was born. Let's start with the most popular version. In this telling, Saint Valentine was a priest in 3rd century Rome during the reign of Emperor Claudius II. The emperor, concerned that unmarried soldiers made better fighters, less worried about wives and children, banned marriage among young men. Valentine, believing love to be sacred and unstoppable, continued to perform weddings in secret. He was caught, arrested, imprisoned. While in prison, he supposedly healed the jailer's blind daughter, and, just before his execution, sent her a note signed, "From your Valentine." A tragic ending, a tender beginning. It's a lovely story. But is it true? Well, probably not. At least, not all of it. There's no clear record of this tale until several hundred years after the events supposedly took place. The letter, the healing, the romantic resistance, all likely embellishments added over time by storytellers who, understandably, found the drama irresistible. But facts, in matters of love and sainthood, are often less important than feelings. And, by the Middle Ages, the story of Valentine had taken hold. So how did he become linked with romance? One theory points to an old belief that birds began to mate in mid-February, specifically on the 14th. Chaucer himself mentions this in his poem Parlement of Fool, written in the 1380s. For this was on Saint Valentine's Day, when every fowl cometh there to cheese his make. Roughly translated, on Saint Valentine's Day the birds choose their mates. This charming idea, that nature itself celebrated love on February 14th, helped solidify the day as something special. From birds to hearts was a short leap, especially for medieval poets. Soon, Valentine's Day became a courtly affair. In 15th century France and England, noblemen would draw lots to determine their Valentine for the season, an assigned partner for exchanging gifts, poems, and sometimes polite flirtation. These were often ceremonial with no expectation of true romance, but occasionally sparks flew. Some even penned Valentine missives long before Hallmark existed. One such letter from Charles, Duke of Orléans to his wife while imprisoned in the Tower of London reads, "Je suis déjà d'amour tanné. Ma très dulce Valentine. Roughly, I am already wearied with love, my very gentle Valentine. Whether weary or not, Charles wrote over 60 poems to her. The church, interestingly, was never quite sure what to do with Saint Valentine. He remained a recognized martyr, but the romantic associations were never official doctrine. By the 1960s, the Catholic Church even quietly removed his feast day from the general liturgical calendar, not as a slight, but simply due to the lack of reliable information about his life. Still, the world had already made up its mind. Valentine had become the patron saint of roses, rhymes, and rapidly beating hearts. Of course, medieval Valentine celebrations looked nothing like ours today. There were no cards with glitter, no dinner reservations, but there was joy. Young people would exchange verses. Families would bake sweet rolls shaped like doves. In some villages, men dressed as birds, yes, birds, and paraded through the streets offering flowers to women of their choice. One record from Kent mentions a Valentine fair, where games included throwing rose petals at suitors. The winner received a ribbon and perhaps a promise. Even in the quieter corners of society, Valentine's Day crept in. In a small convent in Saxony, nuns were allowed to send anonymous notes of encouragement to each other on February 14th. One wrote, "Thou hast smiled each morning even when the bread was black. Thou art my Valentine, and God has noticed." So tonight, as we return to our own quiet corners, let's remember, the story of Saint Valentine is not a clear one. It is tangled, layered, full of guesswork and poetry, but perhaps that's fitting, for love itself is rarely simple. It arrives unexpectedly. It bends the truth. It rewrites the rules. And it leaves behind just enough evidence that we believe, wholeheartedly, in its power, even when we don't know all the details, especially then. The candle is low. Your eyes are heavy. But before we drift into sleep, let us turn the page on a section of medieval life that is, quite frankly, deliciously strange. Because if you've ever received questionable advice about love, say, from a well-meaning aunt or a mysterious blog post, you are not alone. Our ancestors in the Middle Ages, too, were surrounded by guidance on matters of the heart. Some of it sweet, some of it wise, and some of it wonderfully, unbelievably bizarre. Let's begin with one of the more famous sources, Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century courtier who wrote De Amore, The Art of Courtly Love. His book claimed to be a manual on romantic behavior, drawn from the noble courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine. In it, he proposed such gems as, "Marriage is no excuse for not loving. A true lover is always pale and trembling, and perhaps most charmingly, the man who is easily won is not much, esteemed by the woman. In other words, play hard to get." Even in the 1100s, other manuals offered home remedies for attraction. A 13th century herbal text suggests, "To attract a suitor, rub marjoram on your chest before church. For a woman to keep a man's attention, she should wear basil in her shoes. And if all else fails, try goat's milk mixed with fennel, applied to the forehead before sunrise." It's unclear whether this improved romantic appeal or just smelled interesting. Perhaps even stranger were the recipes for love charms. These circulated widely, passed from wise women to curious maids, from alchemists to adventurous monks. One love charm included a dried frog's leg, 3 drops of honey, a lock of the beloved's hair, and a chant performed under a waxing moon. Another advised wearing a necklace of onions and whispering the object of your affection's name into a well at dawn. One can only imagine the results. Not all love advice was physical. Some was philosophical and deeply contradictory. A 14th century French pamphlet warned, "He who praises her too much will seem foolish, but he who does not praise at all will lose her." Another advised young men to never speak first, but always reply as if you were thinking of her already. That's impressive strategy, and probably exhausting. Some advice leaned toward deception. A manuscript from Prague includes this entry: "If you wish to know whether she loves you, drop your glove. If she picks it up, she is yours. If she steps on it, she is clever. If she returns it with a smile, you may proceed. Proceed to what, exactly? The book does not say. Elsewhere, a German source suggests, if your love is uncertain, pretend to favor another. Jealousy reveals truth. This remains controversial. Women, too, were offered complex instructions. A Romanesque text known as the Mirror of the Maiden advised, speak softly and often of books, but never say you know them. Laugh, but never with your teeth. If he offers you fruit, refuse it 3 times. Then accept only the smallest. If fruit was a common love token, no wonder people were always writing about pears. Some of the strangest advice came from astrologers. One guidebook insisted that people born under the sign of Virgo should avoid Geminis entirely, while Aries and Scorpio should marry quickly and often. Another claimed that Tuesday was the worst day to confess love, but the best day to leave someone. And of course, never begin a romance during Mercury retrograde, even if no one knew what that meant at the time. Amid all the contradictions, there were moments of sincerity. A 12th century Welsh proverb reads, "He who gives bread before asking for it shall dine together twice," which sounds oddly like, feed her first, flirt later. And a line from an anonymous English source offers, be near her when the fire is low, when the dogs are asleep and the room is quiet. That is when the heart decides. Not bad advice, really. One of the most touching pieces comes from a Sicilian folk tale where an old woman tells her granddaughter, if he brings you a flower, smile. If he brings you silence, listen. If he brings you his foolishness, take it gently in your hand. That is love. It's gentle, unexpected, and more useful than frog legs. So what can we learn from all this strange advice? That even across centuries and cultures, people have tried desperately, comically, earnestly to understand the mystery of love. They've turned to herbs, stars, rituals, and rules, and still it slips through their fingers, soft as basil beneath a shoe. So tonight, as we wrap ourselves in sleep, perhaps smile at the thought of a medieval lover rising early to apply goat's milk to his brow, or a girl refusing a pear 3 times, just to follow a rule she only half believes. Because sometimes the most foolish advice is also the most hopeful, and love, even in its oddest forms, has always been worth trying for. The moon is high. The world is hushed. A breeze stirs the leaves, brushing them like a page not quite ready to turn. And somewhere, in a tree near a forgotten wall, a nightingale sings. Its song is delicate, liquid, almost too soft to notice, unless you are very still and very willing to listen. In the Middle Ages, this little bird carried more meaning than most poems dared to explain. It was, to poets and lovers alike, the guardian of midnight secrets, a symbol of longing, devotion, and those tender, unreachable moments between heartbeats. And now, as we close this long, meandering tale of medieval romance, let us follow the sound of the nightingale one last time. Medieval literature is full of nightingales. They appear in songs, stories, tapestries, even legal disputes, though rarely willingly. To the people of the time, the nightingale was not just a bird. It was a metaphor, a messenger, and sometimes a cautionary tale. Its nighttime singing, unlike most birds that chirp by day, made it seem uniquely tied to love in secret, to the hush of garden meetings and the ache of unspoken words. One of the most famous references comes from a 12th century tale called Le Ustic, written by Marie de France. In it, a married woman and her neighbor fall in love, though they can only speak through the window at night. She tells her husband she listens to a nightingale. When he discovers the truth, he traps and kills the bird, throwing its body at her. The woman wraps the bird in silk and gold, keeping it as a symbol of her loss. Tragic, poetic, deeply medieval, and perhaps a bit excessive. But no one ever accused the Middle Ages of being subtle. To the troubadours of southern France, the nightingale was a kind of spirit guide. They wrote of it as a teacher in the art of longing. Let the nightingale teach thee patience, one wrote, for she sings and receives no reply, yet never tires. In an age where love was often from afar, across balconies or between families, that image struck a deep chord. To love and not be answered. To wait and still sing. What could be more?
Romantic?
In courtly allegories, the nightingale was paired with the rose, the bird and the bloom, voice and beauty, yearning and reward. This pairing appears again and again, sometimes with the bird winning the rose, sometimes failing, but always trying, because that was the spirit of medieval romance, the effort, the gesture, the hopeful flight in the dark. Even when it didn't end in marriage, even when it ended in poetry, there were lighter stories too. One tale tells of a man who pretended to be a nightingale, hiding in a hedge and singing to woo a woman. She found him, threw a bucket of water over the hedge, married him anyway. Another story, from Spain, describes a noblewoman who kept a nightingale in a silver cage. Every time a suitor visited, she'd cover the cage if she wasn't interested. If the bird was singing when they entered, they stayed. It was, she claimed, the bird's choice. In monasteries, some monks recorded hearing nightingales during long night prayers and likened it to the voice of God passing through the keyhole. To them, the bird was not romantic, but spiritual, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, something beautiful might sing. And isn't that in a way also what love is? As we end our journey, the nightingale stands as a kind of emblem, not of grand gestures, but of quiet persistence, of love that continues, even in uncertainty, of beauty offered freely, with no guarantee it will be returned. And yes, of songs sung in the dark. So what have we learned, dear listener, across these 22 soft-lit tales? We've learned that love in the Middle Ages was complex, funny, formal, foolish, and fearless, that it wore boots and embroidered gloves, that it climbed balconies, carved poems into benches, and whispered through hedges, that it sang in Latin, sighed in French, and danced in muddy fields, and above all, that it tried, again and again, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes tragically, but always with heart. And now, as the candles dim and the pages close, let us leave this world of courtly codes and secret gardens. But before we go, one last image, a nightingale, perched on a branch, singing not for glory, or audience, or victory, but simply because the sky has grown dark and the song is still inside her. She sings, because that's what love does. Good night, and thank you for listening.